Ambassador Queck stared at the holographic display with the kind of expression usually reserved for finding a space slug in your morning nutrition paste. The red dots covering the Zolonian outer colonies weren't getting any smaller, and neither was the migraine building behind his 3 eyes. 17 settlements evacuated in the past month, reported Commander Blith, her tentacles nervously coiling around her datapad. The Vorthak has destroyed 3 mining operations, 2 agricultural domes, and somehow figured out how to turn off the automated defense systems. It's like it's getting smarter. Quex rubbed his temples with all 4 hands. The Galactic Council had dealt with plenty of dangerous fauna before, but the Vorthak was something special. 6 meters of pure muscle, razor-sharp claws, and an apparent grudge against anything that looked remotely civilized. Their best military squads had tried everything from plasma nets to sonic disruptors. The beast just shrugged them off like a minor inconvenience and went back to redecorating settlements into modern art installations of twisted metal and terror. "What about the Corvan battle specialists?" Quex asked, though he already knew the answer from Blythe's expression. They took one look at the reconnaissance footage and politely declined. Something about previous engagements and sudden family emergencies across the galaxy? Blythe's voice carried the special kind of disgust reserved for mercenaries with functioning survival instincts. The council chamber fell into the uncomfortable silence that typically preceded someone suggesting something monumentally stupid. Quex could practically hear the gears turning in their collective heads, searching for any solution that didn't involve writing off an entire star system to insurance fraud. "What about humans?" squeaked Counselor Pip from the far end of the table. Every head in the room turned toward the diminutive Floxian. Pip immediately tried to shrink behind his oversized spectacles, but the damage was done. Someone had said the H word, and now they all had to pretend it wasn't the most ridiculous suggestion they'd heard since Counselor Vex proposed solving their budget crisis with a bake sale. "Humans," Quex repeated slowly, as if tasting something unpleasant. "You want to hire humans?" "Well, they are apex predators," Pip offered weakly. "I've seen the documentaries. They persistence hunt across vast distances, they craft weapons from basic materials, and they have this terrifying thing called adrenaline that makes them stronger when threatened. Plus, they're the only species crazy enough to keep carnivorous animals as companions for fun." The room murmured with the kind of nervous energy that suggested everyone was either impressed by Pip's research or concerned about his viewing habits. Quex had to admit the logic was sound, in a deeply disturbing way. Humans had a reputation throughout the galaxy as the species that looked at Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest and said, "Hold my fermented grain beverage." They climbed mountains for entertainment, jumped out of perfectly functional aircraft for thrills, and somehow managed to domesticate wolves into creatures that wore tiny sweaters and answered to names like Princess Sparkles. "Fine," Quex said, the word tasting like defeat and bureaucratic desperation. "Contact Earth. Tell them we have a hunting job." 3 days later, Jake Morrison stepped off the transport shuttle at Zolonian Station Prime with the kind of easy smile that suggested he either had no idea what he was getting into, or he was the most confident human in the galaxy. Given that he was carrying a duffel bag full of camera equipment instead of enough firepower to level a small moon, Quex was leaning toward the first option. "You must be Ambassador Quex," Jake said, extending his hand in that bizarre human greeting ritual that involved voluntary physical contact with strangers. "Jake Morrison, wildlife photographer. Thanks for the gig. I have to say, when your posting mentioned a rare predator species in need of documentation, I jumped at the chance." Quex stared at the offered hand like it might explode, then looked up at Jake's face. The human was tall, even by human standards, with the kind of weathered features that suggested he spent more time outdoors than was strictly healthy. He wore something called a flannel shirt and pants with more pockets than any reasonable garment should possess. This was their apex predator hunter. "Documentation," Quex repeated slowly. "Oh yeah, I specialize in apex predators. Grizzly bears, mountain lions, wolves. Got some amazing shots of a pack hunt in Yellowstone last year. The way they coordinate their attacks is just beautiful." Jake's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone discussing their favorite hobby rather than mortal combat with nature's killing machines. Commander Blith leaned over and whispered urgently in Quex's ear. "Sir, I'm reading his bio now. It says here he's spent the last 15 years photographing dangerous wildlife in their natural habitats. There's a notation about something called National Geographic." "Is that a military organization?" Quex whispered back. "Unknown, sir, but it sounds ominous." Jake, meanwhile, had started unpacking his gear with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Telephoto lenses, tripods, something called a trail camera, and enough battery packs to power a small settlement. What Quex didn't see was a single weapon designed for anything more threatening than a mildly aggressive houseplant. "So where's this big guy hanging out?" Jake asked, shouldering a backpack that looked like it could survive a nuclear winter. "I've got about 6 hours of good light left, and I'd love to get some behavioral footage before we lose visibility." "Behavioral footage," Quex echoed, feeling like he was trapped in some kind of linguistic feedback loop. "Yeah, hunting patterns, territorial markings, social interactions. Though, from your description, this Vorthok sounds like a solitary predator. Those are always the trickiest to photograph. They tend to be more suspicious of observers." Jake paused, studying Quex's expression. "You guys do know I'm here to document the creature, not hunt it, right? I mean, I could probably scare it off with some noisemakers if it's bothering the locals, but I'm not exactly equipped for pest control." The silence that followed was the kind usually associated with the moment someone realizes they've made a catastrophic mistake. Quex felt his 3 eyes begin to twitch in sequence, a sure sign that his stress levels had exceeded the recommended daily allowance. "Mr. Morrison," Quex said carefully, "when we said hunting, we meant hunting, as in tracking down and eliminating a dangerous threat to galactic security." Jake blinked. "Oh, well, that's awkward." He scratched his head thoughtfully. "I'm really more of a live and let live kind of guy. Plus, I left all my hunting gear back in Montana. This is just camera stuff." Commander Blith made a sound like air escaping from a punctured habitat dome. Somewhere in the distance, Quex could swear he heard the collective hopes of 17 evacuated colonies deflating like a sad party balloon. 2 hours later, Jake found himself crammed into an armored hover transport with 3 of the most nervous aliens he'd ever met. Lieutenant Zork kept checking his plasma rifle every 30 seconds. Sergeant Mex had developed a facial tic that made his antennae twitch rhythmically. And Private Klex was stress-eating something that looked like purple moss and smelled like gym socks. "So this Vorthok," Jake said, adjusting his telephoto lens with the casual air of someone discussing weekend plans. "How big are we talking? Like grizzly bear big, or more elephant seal territory?" Zork's voice cracked when he answered. "Approximately 6 meters in length, Mr. Morrison, with claws that can slice through reinforced titanium plating." "Nice, great photo opportunities there. And you said it's been acting aggressively towards settlements? That's actually pretty unusual behavior for most apex predators. They typically avoid large groups of potential threats unless they're protecting territory or offspring." Jake pulled out what looked like a small electronic device and started fiddling with dials. "This is a motion sensor camera. If we can get it set up near a game trail, we might catch some natural behaviors." The transport lurched as they entered the outer perimeter of Vorthak territory, and all 3 soldiers immediately went to high alert. Weapons were checked, armor was adjusted, and prayers were muttered in at least 4 different languages. Jake, meanwhile, had pulled out a notebook and was sketching the landscape while humming something that sounded suspiciously cheerful. "Mr. Morrison," Sergeant Mex whispered urgently, "perhaps you should prepare your, hunting equipment now." Jake looked up from his notes. "Oh, I'm always prepared. Trail mix, water, extra batteries for the cameras. Though I should probably set up the telephoto about 200 meters out. Don't want to get too close on the first encounter. Might spook him." The concept of a human being concerned about spooking a 6-meter murder machine seemed to break something fundamental in Zork's worldview. He stared at Jake with the expression of someone watching the laws of physics take a coffee break. They sat down in a clearing that showed obvious signs of Vorthak activity. Trees were scratched up to a height that suggested something very large and very grumpy had used them as scratching posts. The ground was torn up in patterns that looked less like footprints and more like someone had been conducting aggressive landscaping with a chainsaw. Jake hopped out of the transport with the enthusiasm of a tourist arriving at his dream vacation destination. "Oh wow, look at these claw marks. The depth and spacing suggest a quadruped with retractable claws, probably around 8 centimeters long. And check out this scat. Still relatively fresh, maybe 12 hours old." He actually crouched down and started examining what the soldiers had been very carefully avoiding. Lots of bone fragments, some plant matter. So he's an omnivore, which explains the territorial behavior. Mixed diet usually means more complex behavioral patterns. Private Klex made a strangled noise. "Sir, you're analyzing its droppings. Best way to understand dietary habits and general health. Back home, I spent 3 weeks tracking a pack of wolves just by following their scat trail. Learned more about their hunting patterns from their bathroom habits than from direct observation." Jake stood up, brushing off his hands with the satisfaction of someone who just solved a particularly interesting puzzle. The forest around them had gone suspiciously quiet. Even the alien equivalent of birds had apparently decided they had pressing engagements elsewhere. The 3 soldiers formed a defensive triangle around Jake, weapons aimed outward, while Jake set up his first trail camera on a nearby tree. "Mr. Morrison," Zork hissed, Perhaps we should establish a base camp and plan our approach more strategically. Nah, this is perfect. See those broken branches about 10 meters up? That's a trail marker. He's been using this route regularly, probably heading to water. If we're quiet and stay downwind, we might actually get some footage today. Jake pulled out a small device that looked like a modified compass. Wind's coming from the northeast, so we'll want to approach from the south. And everybody try to avoid stepping on anything crunchy. Sound travels really well in forest environments. The irony was not lost on the three heavily armed soldiers that they were now taking stealth advice from someone whose idea of dangerous wildlife involved animals that, at worst, might give you a stern talking to, before wandering off to find easier prey. Jake had just finished adjusting his camera settings when a sound echoed through the forest that made all three soldiers simultaneously question their life choices. It was part roar, part howl, and part industrial accident involving large machinery and someone with anger management issues. "There he is," Jake whispered, with the kind of excitement usually reserved for winning the lottery or discovering pizza. "Sounds like he's maybe half a kilometer northeast. Perfect wind conditions for approach." And before anyone could stop him, Jake Morrison shouldered his camera bag and started walking directly toward the sound that had just made three trained military professionals seriously consider career changes in accounting. The next 20 minutes felt like the longest nature documentary ever filmed, if nature documentaries typically involved three aliens having simultaneous nervous breakdowns while following a human who seemed to think he was on a casual hiking trip. Jake moved through the forest with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years sneaking up on animals that could turn him into an impromptu snack, while his escorts sounded like a marching band having an argument with a pile of scrap metal. "Morrison," Zork whispered for the 14th time. "Perhaps we should call for backup." "Shh," Jake replied, holding up one hand while adjusting his camera with the other. "We're getting close. See those fresh scratch marks? And that tree over there is completely stripped of bark at exactly 6 meters up. He's marking territory, which means we're probably near a den site or a favorite hunting spot." The forest had taken on the kind of oppressive silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or violent death. Even the alien insects had apparently decided to take an early lunch break. The only sounds were the careful footsteps of their group and what sounded suspiciously like Sergeant Mech's hyperventilating through his breathing apparatus. Then Jake stopped so suddenly that Klex walked directly into him, creating a brief moment of confusion that involved a lot of flailing appendages and creative alien profanity. "There," Jake breathed, raising his camera with the reverence of someone who'd just spotted the Holy Grail having coffee with Bigfoot. Through a gap in the trees, they could see it. The Vorthak was even more impressive in person than the reconnaissance footage had suggested. 6.5 meters of pure predator, with midnight black fur that seemed to absorb light, and muscle definition that looked like it had been carved by someone who took anatomy very seriously. Its claws were indeed the size of small swords, and when it turned its massive head in their direction, its eyes reflected the filtered sunlight like polished amber. Come on. It was, objectively speaking, the most terrifying thing any of them had ever seen. The kind of creature that evolution had spent millions of years perfecting into the ultimate nope machine. "Oh, wow," Jake whispered, and the three soldiers prepared to drag his mangled corpse back to civilization. "You're magnificent." The Vorthak's head swiveled toward them with predatory precision. For a moment that lasted approximately 17 eternities, human and alien death machines stared at each other across 30 meters of forest floor. The creature's nostrils flared, scenting the air, and its massive shoulders tensed as if preparing to demonstrate exactly why 17 colonies had decided to become refugees. Zork raised his plasma rifle. Mex activated his shield generator. Klex started what sounded like a traditional Floxian death chant. Jake raised his camera and started taking pictures. The rapid-fire click of the camera shutter echoed through the forest like automatic weapon fire. If automatic weapons were designed by someone with a deep appreciation for artistic composition rather than wholesale destruction. The Vortak's ears, which were surprisingly large and mobile for such a fearsome predator, swiveled toward the sound with obvious curiosity. "Easy there, big guy," Jake murmured, lowering the camera but keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Nobody here wants to hurt you. Well, these three might have some strong opinions, but I'm just here for the photo shoot." The creature took a step forward, and the ground literally trembled under its weight. Its claws, each one capable of opening a transport shuttle like a particularly aggressive can opener, dug furrows in the earth. But something in its posture seemed less, "I'm about to redecorate this forest with your internal organs," and more, "I'm trying to figure out what the hell you people are doing in my living room." "You know what I think," Jake said, and the three soldiers simultaneously wished he would stop thinking and start running. "I think you're not actually aggressive. I think you're territorial, sure, but look at those ears. The way you're holding your head, you're curious about us." The Vorthak tilted its massive head, And Jake felt that familiar thrill he got whenever he managed to connect with a wild animal. Back home, he'd had similar moments with mountain lions, bears, even a particularly grumpy moose named Henderson who lived near his cabin. "The settlements you've been visiting?" Jake continued, his voice taking on the calm, conversational tone he used with all potentially dangerous wildlife. "I bet they were built in places you used to go. Water sources, maybe? Or favorite hunting grounds?" The creature took another step closer, and now Jake could see the intelligence in those amber eyes. This wasn't just a mindless killing machine. This was a thinking, feeling being who'd probably been having the worst month of his life watching strange alien structures pop up in all his favorite spots. "Oh, you poor guy," Jake said, and the empathy in his voice was so genuine that even the vortex seemed to respond to it. "You're not a monster. You're just lonely and confused and probably really, really annoyed that a bunch of strangers moved into your neighborhood without asking." Behind him, he could hear Lieutenant Zork making small, distressed noises, but Jake's attention was entirely focused on the massive predator that had begun to lower its head in what looked almost like a gesture of curiosity rather than aggression. "I know exactly how you feel, buddy," Jake said softly. "Back on Earth, we've got this saying, all behavior is communication. And I think what you've been trying to communicate is that you just want your space back." The Vorthok sat down, 6.5 meters of apex predator, the terror of 17 star systems, the creature that had single-handedly caused the largest civilian evacuation in Galactic Council history, sat down like an enormous, deadly dog who'd just been offered a treat. In the stunned silence that followed, Jake Morrison did what any reasonable wildlife photographer would do when faced with a once-in-a-lifetime shot. He started taking pictures again. What happened next would later be described in official Galactic Council reports as unprecedented interspecies contact protocols, though Jake would always think of it as Tuesday afternoon with a really big dog who needed a friend. The Vorthak watched with fascination as Jake moved around it in a careful circle, camera clicking steadily. Each time Jake shifted position, those massive amber eyes tracked his movement with the kind of intelligent attention that suggested the creature was learning as much about Jake as Jake was learning about it. "Yeah, that's it, just hold that pose," Jake murmured, crouching down to get a better angle on the creature's impressive profile. "You're a natural. Ever consider a career in modeling?" Behind him, the three soldiers were having what could generously be called a collective mental breakdown. Zork's rifle was still raised, but his hands were shaking so badly that he was more likely to shoot a passing cloud than anything terrestrial. Mex had started muttering what sounded like prayers in at least 3 different languages, and Klex appeared to be trying to become one with a nearby tree through the ancient art of really enthusiastic hiding. "Mr. Morrison?" Zork managed to croak. "What exactly are you doing?" "Building trust," Jake replied, without taking his eye off the camera viewfinder. "See how he's not showing his teeth? And his ears are forward, not back. Classic signs of curiosity rather than aggression. Back home, I spent 6 months gaining the trust of a grizzly bear family. Same principles apply." The Vorthak made a sound that was part rumble, part purr, and entirely unlike anything that should have come from a creature capable of reducing spacecraft to abstract art. Jake lowered his camera and looked directly into those intelligent eyes. "You're not getting enough social interaction, are you, big guy?" Jake said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who'd just solved a puzzle that had been bothering him. "Apex predators your size, you'd normally have some kind of pack structure, or at least regular contact with your own species, but you're all alone out here." The creature's ears drooped slightly, and Jake felt his heart do that thing it always did when he encountered an animal in distress. It was the same feeling he'd had when he'd found that injured wolf pup in Glacier National Park, or when he'd discovered the orphaned mountain lion cubs near his cabin. "That's what this is all about, isn't it?" Jake continued, taking a slow step closer. "You're not attacking those settlements because you're aggressive. You're investigating them because you're hoping to find others like you, or at least something that might provide some kind of social stimulation." The Vorthak's massive head tilted, and Jake could swear he saw something like recognition in those amber eyes, or maybe hope. Either way, it was enough to make him reach into his backpack and pull out his emergency lunch. "I know it's not much," Jake said, unwrapping what appeared to be some kind of protein bar. "But sharing food is pretty much universal friendship language across most species." He tossed the bar gently toward the creature, who sniffed it with nostrils the size of dinner plates, before delicately picking it up with claws that could have easily sliced Jake into julienne strips. The Vorthak examined the offering with the careful attention of a food critic, then ate it in one careful bite. The rumbling purr that followed was so deep that Jake could feel it in his chest. "There we go," Jake said, grinning with the satisfaction of someone who'd just successfully communicated across species barriers. "You know what? You remind me of this Newfoundland I used to know. Huge, intimidating to strangers, but really just wanted someone to pay attention to him. He reached into his pack again and pulled out his entire emergency food supply. Trail mix, energy bars, even his backup jerky. Here, buddy. I bet you haven't had a decent meal in weeks. As the Vorthak carefully accepted each offering, Jake found himself falling into the same routine he used with all the wildlife he'd worked with over the years. Slow movements, calm voice, respect for the animal's space and autonomy. The fact that this particular animal could have easily bench-pressed a small building was just a minor detail. "You know what you need?" Jake said, settling down on a fallen log as if he were having a conversation with an old friend rather than a legendary terror of the galaxy. "You need a name. Can't keep calling you the Vorthak, like you're some kind of natural disaster. How about—" He studied the creature's massive, dignified features. "Buddy. Yeah, you look like a buddy to me." The newly christened Buddy made another one of those rumbling purrs and actually moved closer, settling down in a position that allowed Jake to get some truly spectacular close-up shots of his facial features. It was at this moment that Lieutenant Zork chose to make his presence known again. "Mr. Morrison," he called out in a voice that suggested he was operating on the very edge of his sanity. "What are you doing now?" "Oh, just getting to know Buddy here," Jake replied, as if sitting within arm's reach of a 6-meter apex predator was the most normal thing in the world. "Turns out he's actually pretty friendly once you approach him correctly. Classic case of misunderstood animal behavior." "The Buddy?" Sergeant Mech squeaked from behind his tree. Yeah, he needed a proper name. Can't keep calling him the Vorthak like he's some kind of monster. He's just a big guy who's been having a rough time adjusting to all the changes in his territory. Jake reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements the way he would with any large predator, and gently scratched behind one of Buddy's enormous ears. The resulting purr was so loud that several small rocks fell from a nearby cliff face. "See?" Jake said, grinning at the 3 soldiers who were staring at him like he'd just performed actual magic. "He's not a threat, he's just lonely. Probably hasn't had proper social contact in months, maybe years. All that aggressive behavior toward the settlements? He was probably just trying to figure out if anyone wanted to be friends." Private Klex emerged from behind his tree with the cautious movements of someone who wasn't entirely convinced that reality was functioning according to normal parameters. "Sir," he said carefully, "are you suggesting that the most feared predator in this sector of the galaxy is actually just lonely?" "Pretty much, yeah." Jake gave Buddy another scratch, which resulted in what could only be described as the galaxy's most terrifying attempt at a happy wiggle. Happens all the time with apex predators. Remove them from their normal social structures, disrupt their territory, and they start acting out. It's not aggression, it's just really poor communication skills. He pulled out his camera again and started scrolling through the photos he'd taken. "Look at these shots. See the body language, the ear position, the way he's holding his tail? Classic signs of an animal that wants to interact but doesn't know how. Back on Earth, we see this all the time with animals that have been displaced from their natural habitats." Ambassador Quex chose that moment to contact them via the communication device strapped to Zork's wrist. His voice crackled through the speaker with barely contained panic. "Lieutenant Zork, report. Have you located the creature? What's your status?" Zork looked at Jake, who was now showing Buddy the photos on his camera's display screen while the creature examined them with obvious interest. Then looked back at the communicator. "Sir," Zork said slowly, "the situation has evolved." 3 hours later, Ambassador Quex stood in the forest clearing, staring at a scene that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his natural life, though not for the reasons he'd expected. Jake Morrison sat on a fallen log, scrolling through wildlife photos on his camera, while providing running commentary to a 6-meter apex predator who was listening, with the rapt attention of a graduate student attending the lecture of a lifetime. "And this one here is a grizzly bear I tracked for 2 weeks in Alaska," Jake was saying, tilting the camera screen toward Buddy, who had somehow managed to position himself like an enormous, deadly puppy. "See how she's fishing for salmon? That's a learned behavior, passed down through generations. Took her 3 tries to get this particular fish, but persistence pays off." Buddy made one of his rumbling purrs and actually leaned closer to get a better look at the image. His massive claws, each one capable of turning a hover tank into modern art, were carefully tucked under his body to avoid accidentally destroying Jake's equipment. "Ambassador Quex," Jake called out cheerfully. "Meet Buddy. Buddy, this is Ambassador Quex. He's the one who hired me to come document you." Quex made a sound like a deflating balloon having an existential crisis. Commander Blythe, who had arrived with the second wave of reinforcements, was busy trying to process a situation that wasn't covered in any military manual ever written. The fact that their dangerous alien threat was currently receiving what appeared to be a nature photography lecture from a human wildlife photographer was stretching everyone's understanding of reality to its breaking point. "Mr. Morrison," Quex managed to say, his voice carrying the special kind of exhaustion reserved for bureaucrats whose carefully laid plans had been derailed by forces beyond their comprehension. "What exactly has happened here?" "Oh, the usual," Jake replied, giving Buddy another scratch behind the ears that resulted in a purr so deep it registered on seismic equipment. Turned out the problem wasn't that Buddy here was aggressive. The problem was that nobody had bothered to ask him what he actually needed. He stood up and pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages covered with sketches and observations. "See, Buddy's what we call a social apex predator. In his natural state, he'd have a family group, maybe a territory shared with others of his species. But based on the evidence I've gathered, he's been alone for at least 2 years, possibly longer." "Alone?" Commander Blath asked, her tentacles unconsciously curling in what might have been sympathy. "Yup. And when social animals get isolated, they start exhibiting what we call displacement behaviors. In Buddy's case, that meant investigating anything that might provide social stimulation, even if it meant approaching settlements that probably scared the hell out of him just as much as he scared them." Jake flipped to another page in his notebook. The attacks on the settlements weren't actually attacks at all. They were investigation attempts. Buddy was trying to figure out if these new structures contained potential companions, or at least something interesting to interact with. The fact that everyone ran away screaming probably just reinforced his isolation and made him try harder. Buddy, as if responding to his name, made another rumbling sound and nudged Jake's shoulder with his massive head. The gesture was so clearly affectionate that even Quex found himself reconsidering his entire worldview. "So," Quex said carefully, "you're telling me that the greatest threat to galactic security in this sector was actually just lonely?" "Pretty much, yeah. It's more common than you'd think. Back on Earth, we've had similar situations with wolves, bears, even elephants. Remove them from their social structures, disrupt their territories, and they start acting out. The solution isn't elimination, it's understanding and accommodation." Jake pulled out his communicator and started scrolling through what appeared to be official documents. "I've been doing some research while we were bonding, and it turns out the Galactic Council has protocols for exactly this kind of situation. Section 47B of the Interspecies Cohabitation Guidelines specifically addresses the rights of indigenous apex predators to maintain territorial access." "You've been researching galactic law?" Commander Blith asked, her surprise evident even through her translator. "Wildlife photographer, remember? You can't do this job without understanding conservation law, territorial rights, and environmental protection statutes. It's all the same principles, just on a bigger scale." Jake scratched Buddy behind the ears again, which prompted another seismic purr. "According to your own regulations, Buddy here has legal claim to this entire sector as ancestral territory." The silence that followed was the kind usually associated with the moment everyone realizes they've been doing something incredibly stupid for a very long time. "Furthermore," Jake continued with the confidence of someone who'd spent years dealing with bureaucrats who thought wildlife was something that happened to other people, "the settlements can easily coexist with Buddy if they just follow basic apex predator protocols, maintain clear boundaries, provide alternative routes for territorial movement, and maybe set up some kind of regular social interaction schedule." "Social interaction schedule?" Quex repeated weakly. "Sure. Buddy's clearly intelligent and social. He doesn't need much. Just regular acknowledgement of his presence, and maybe some interactive enrichment activities. I'm thinking something like scheduled photography sessions, environmental monitoring partnerships, maybe even some kind of cultural exchange program." Jake pulled out his camera and showed them a photo of Buddy carefully examining a trail camera. "Look at how fascinated he is by technology. I bet he'd love to help with scientific research projects. Win-win situation. Everyone gets what they need." Commander Blith stared at the photo, then at Buddy, who was now demonstrating his newfound friendship with Jake by gently grooming the human's hair with a tongue the size of a small towel. "You're suggesting we hire him? Why not? He knows this territory better than anyone. He's clearly intelligent enough to understand complex concepts, and he's got the kind of natural camouflage and stealth abilities that would make him invaluable for environmental monitoring. Plus, he works for Food and Attention, which is probably the most cost-effective employment contract in galactic history." Quex felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. "And the settlements, the evacuated colonies, can start moving back immediately as long as they follow the cohabitation protocols. Buddy's not interested in hurting anyone. He just wants acknowledgement and respect for his territorial rights. Set up some boundary markers, maybe establish a few designated interaction zones, and everyone can live happily ever after." Jake stood up and gave Buddy a final pat on his massive shoulder. "I'll stick around for a few weeks to help with the transition, Make sure everyone understands the new arrangements. Consider it part of the documentation project. As if to seal the deal, Buddy approached Ambassador Quex with the careful movements of someone trying very hard not to appear threatening. He lowered his massive head and made a sound that was unmistakably a greeting. Quex, drawing on reserves of diplomatic courage he didn't know he possessed, reached out with one trembling hand and gently patted Buddy's nose. The resulting purr was so loud that it caused a flock of local birds to take flight in formation. "Well," Quex said, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and the kind of bewildered acceptance that comes from having one's worldview completely reorganized by a human with a camera and an inexplicable ability to make friends with galactic-level threats. "I suppose we'll need to update our threat assessment protocols, and maybe consider a new position in our organizational structure," Commander Blythe added, looking at Jake with something approaching awe. "What do you think about the title Interspecies Relations Specialist?" Jake grinned, giving Buddy one more scratch behind the ears. "I think that sounds perfect, but I'm keeping the photography job too. Someone's got to document all the amazing wildlife out here, and that's how the Galactic Council's most feared security threat became their first official interspecies cultural ambassador, complete with benefits, territorial rights, and a human best friend who understood that sometimes the most dangerous monsters just needed someone to listen." The evacuation order was lifted the next day. The 17 colonies resumed normal operations within the week, and Buddy, for the first time in years, was no longer alone. As for Jake Morrison, he'd found a story of a lifetime and a friend who would make sure he never ran out of spectacular photo opportunities. After all, there's nothing quite like having a 6-meter apex predator who's excited to show you all the best spots in his territory. Some problems, it turned out, couldn't be solved with bigger weapons or stronger defenses. Sometimes all you needed was someone willing to sit down, share a sandwich, and ask the simple question, "What do you actually need?" And sometimes the answer was as simple as, "I just want a friend." In his final report to the Galactic Council, Ambassador Quex would write, "Threat assessment protocols updated. Security status resolved through diplomatic channels. Note for future reference, when dealing with unknown alien behaviors, consider consulting humans. Their approach to problem-solving remains baffling but effective." He didn't mention that he'd started carrying trail mix in his diplomatic pouch, just in case he ran into any other monsters who might just be having a bad day. After all, you never knew when you might need to make a new friend.